The winds howled across the endless golden fields of the Whitfield Ranch, flattening the brittle prairie grass as if nature itself mourned alongside the living. It was the kind of bitter cold afternoon that made folks' bones ache, even through their Sunday best. Yet the entire town had gathered along the edge of the property, clustering in tight knots beside the weather-beaten wooden fence, their voices a low, uneasy murmur beneath the leaden sky. At the very heart of this uneasy crowd stood Clara Whitfield, a striking woman in her late 20s, shoulders squared in a defiant posture that betrayed her trembling hands. Her dark hair was swept back in a loose bun, a few rebellious curls framing her pale face, her gray eyes glistening with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of them. Her black dress, plain but impeccably pressed, seemed to absorb the chill of the day, wrapping around her frame like a shield. Beside her, the new gravestone jutted from the earth, its inscription barely visible through a thin coat of dust and frost. Samuel Whitfield, beloved husband. There was no gentle comfort in the air. The townsfolk watched Clara with thinly veiled suspicion, lips pressed into hard lines as they whispered behind gloved hands. Some offered tight, forced smiles. Others glanced away when her gaze met theirs. The women clucked their tongues, speculating in hushed tones about the circumstances of Samuel's death, the fate of the sprawling Whitfield Ranch, and the young widow left to manage it all alone. Everywhere Clara looked, she saw nothing but uncertainty. The town's most powerful ranchers lingered at the periphery, faces carved from stone. Mr. Mallory, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, adjusted his Stetson with a sneer of barely disguised impatience. At his side, Amos Price, his weasel-eyed rival, offered his condolences in a tone as oily as lamp grease, leaning close enough for Clara to smell the whiskey on his breath. "If you ever need help, Miss Whitfield, just know you have friends," he drawled, his meaning clear as glass. Mallory, less subtle, simply leaned in and muttered, "A place like this can swallow a person up, all on her own." Clara stiffened, jaw set. She forced herself to nod politely, eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of kindness. But even those she once called friends, shopkeepers, school teachers, farm hands, regarded her now with a blend of pity and skepticism. Rumors, like wildfire, needed only a spark. The preacher's voice rose in the gray, still air, reciting the old psalm with practiced solemnity, but Clara barely heard him. Her thoughts drifted, helpless and scattered, to the night Samuel died. The sound of hooves pounding across the dark pasture, the thunderous argument in the barn, the gunshot echoing across the fields. She'd run barefoot through the icy mud, reaching the barn door just as Samuel collapsed, blood blooming through his shirt. He'd tried to speak, words lost on a tide of pain. Even now, Clara could still taste the salt of her own tears, feel the warm weight of his hand going cold in hers. Her heart hammered as the funeral ended, the townsfolk dispersing like shadows. The ranchers lingered, circling her like vultures, each offering sympathy laced with veiled threat. Their eyes drifted to the rich, rolling land behind her, the last unbroken stretch of prairie for miles, crisscrossed with fence lines and dotted with grazing horses. Clara knew what they were thinking. Without Samuel, the Whitfield Ranch was vulnerable, a ripe target for anyone bold enough to snatch it. As the last shovelful of earth thudded onto the grave, a subtle movement at the tree line caught Clara's attention. A stranger, tall, cloaked in a worn duster, hat pulled low, stepped silently from the shadows. He carried no flowers, only a battered Stetson in his hand. The crowd seemed not to notice as he knelt by Samuel's grave, fingers brushing the freshly turned earth. For a moment, he bowed his head in silent prayer, lips moving in words only the dead could hear. Then, just as quietly, he rose, placing a single wildflower on the grave before vanishing into the swirling dust. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Something about the man's presence sent a chill racing down her spine. She looked to the preacher, but he was already packing away his Bible, eager to leave the cold behind. No one else seemed to have noticed the stranger at all. As dusk began to fall, Clara found herself standing alone beside Samuel's grave. The vast expanse of the ranch stretched out before her, every acre heavy with memory. Her father had warned her years ago that the prairie was no place for the faint-hearted. But she'd loved Samuel fiercely, loved the life they'd built together, the laughter they'd shared, the quiet evenings by lamplight. This land was all she had left of him now. A cold wind whipped up, rattling the bare branches and sending a flock of crows spiraling overhead. The sky darkened, clouds churning above the hills. Clara drew her shawl tighter and started the long walk back to the ranch house, boots crunching on the frost-bitten ground. Behind her, the whispers continued, rising and falling in the dimming light. They spoke of curses, of secrets buried deep in Whitfield soil, of a young widow with too much land and too many enemies. They wondered, not if she would survive, but how long it would take for her to break. But Clara walked on, head held high, the weight of loss pressing down on her with every step. She didn't look back. In the darkness, far from the grave, the stranger watched from the shadows, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the woman who would soon discover just how dangerous it was to stand alone. The days after the funeral blurred into a cold, restless haze. Clara moved through her old home as if trapped inside a memory, Samuel's presence lingering in every shadow and half-shut door. The ranch, once a place of laughter and quiet joy, felt suddenly vast and empty, every board and window a reminder that she was now truly alone. She kept the old kitchen tidy, the lamps trimmed, the woodpile stocked, stubborn acts of normalcy against the storm brewing outside. In town, the whispers grew sharper. On the morning after Samuel's burial, Clara rode into Main Street, chin lifted, only to find conversations dying as she passed by. Shopkeepers, once eager for her business, avoided her eyes. The butcher wrapped her meat in silence. At the general store, Mrs. Keller, who used to chat over coffee, offered only a stiff nod. Clara tried to ignore the glances and snide comments, but the isolation seeped in. She could feel it even in the ground beneath her boots, as if the very earth was pulling away. But it wasn't just the townsfolk. The ranch itself had become hostile. It started with the water. One morning, Clara led her horse down to the river, only to find the gate upstream chained shut, the water diverted to Mallory's land. When she confronted his men, they simply shrugged, pretending not to understand her anger. A week later, the road leading to town was blocked by fallen branches and a fresh tangle of barbed wire. Her supply wagon was forced to turn back, the driver muttering apologies before quickly leaving. She spent restless nights pacing the wide planked floors, listening for strange noises. Once, she caught a glimpse of movement in the moonlit fields, a dark silhouette near the barn, lingering just long enough to chill her blood. Gripping Samuel's old rifle, Clara crept through the darkened house, every board creaking beneath her. The barn doors hung ajar in the cold wind, swinging just enough to reveal deep boot prints in the dirt. Whoever had come, they hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. Her sleep grew shallow and haunted. Nightmares plagued her. Samuel's face twisted in pain, ranchers closing in with torches and ropes, her home burning as she screamed in the darkness. Sometimes she would jolt awake, sweat-soaked, convinced she heard footsteps on the porch, only to find the night empty and still. Yet she never let fear show, not even when her own reflection in the mirror looked back at her with hollow eyes. A week after the funeral, Clara discovered an anonymous note slipped beneath her door. The handwriting was rough, the message brief. "Leave now if you know what's good for you." Her hands trembled as she held the paper, bile rising in her throat. It was one thing to face veiled threats at a funeral, quite another to know someone had crept so close to her home while she slept. Determined not to be intimidated, Clara pushed herself harder, rising before dawn to check the fences, counting the livestock, patrolling the fields. She fixed broken rails and patched holes herself, refusing to hire outside help. But the isolation cut deep. At dinner, she ate alone at the long pine table. Her only company, the tick of the old clock and the howl of the wind outside. Each day brought new pressures. Amos Price sent a slick-talking lawyer with offers to buy her out, waiving contracts that promised a generous sum for her own good. Mallory's men rode past the edge of her property at all hours, lingering just long enough to make their presence known. Even those who might have stood with her kept their distance, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire between powerful men. Memories of Samuel returned in cruel flashes. A dance in the barn with sawdust in her hair, laughter by the creek, his hand over hers as they planted the first saplings. Those memories, once a comfort, now haunted her like ghosts. There were moments when the loneliness nearly broke her, when she wondered if leaving wasn't the wise thing after all. But something fierce, something Samuel had loved in her, refused to give in. One evening, as dusk settled over the prairie and the horizon blazed gold and purple, Clara stood on the porch with Samuel's battered rifle. The air was heavy, humming with tension. Off in the distance, a rider watched from the shadow of a cottonwood tree. For a moment, the stranger didn't move. Then, as the last light faded, he disappeared into the darkness as silently as he'd come. Later that night, Clara bolted awake, sure she'd heard footsteps in the yard. She rose and crossed to the window, peering into the moonlit yard. There, by the barn, a lantern flickered and went out. Clara gripped the rifle tight and crept outside, heart hammering. But when she reached the barn, there was no one. Only the lingering smell of smoke and the subtle, unmistakable sense that someone had been watching. With her nerves fraying and the threats closing in, Clara understood at last that her fight was not just for land or reputation. It was for survival itself. The ranch was all she had left, the final piece of her old life, the last fragment of Samuel's love. She would hold on to it as long as she drew breath, even if the whole world turned against her. As another night descended, and the winds howled through the empty fields, Clara steeled herself. Whatever secrets lingered in the shadows, whatever dangers crept closer each night, she would face them. Alone if she had to. Because the Whitfield Ranch was her home, and she wasn't ready to let it go. The prairie night stretched long and uneasy, draping the Whitfield Ranch in a cold hush broken only by the distant howl of coyotes. Clara awoke before dawn, unable to shake the chill that had settled in her bones. The note she'd found days ago still haunted her thoughts, its blunt warning echoing louder as the world around her seemed to tighten its grip. Each sunrise brought new unease, as if the land itself was waiting for something to break. On a gray morning when the sky threatened rain, Clara made her usual rounds. She checked the fences, counted the cattle, and kept her eyes open for any sign of trespassers. The unease she felt had become a constant companion, her breath sharp, her gaze wary. As she led her horse toward the old barn at the edge of the property, she noticed the door stood slightly ajar, swaying in the stiff wind. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Samuel had always kept that barn locked tight, claiming it was too dangerous for livestock. Clara's curiosity, sharpened by fear and frustration, overrode her caution. Inside, the barn was a cathedral of shadows. The beams overhead creaked in the wind, dust swirling through the shafts of pale light. She ran her hand along the row of tools, half expecting to find something out of place. But it was the floorboards near the back that caught her eye. A scuff in the dust, the faint outline of boot prints. Clara crouched, tracing the marks, when her palm pressed against a knot in the wood. There was a hollow sound. Heart pounding, she knelt lower, pushing aside loose straw until her fingers found a concealed latch. With a grunt and a splinter to her palm, she lifted a square of floorboard. Beneath it, a hidden room revealed itself, a cramped, earthen cellar that smelled of old secrets and damp earth. Clara hesitated, then lowered herself into the darkness, lantern in hand. The space was cluttered with forgotten relics, battered saddlebags, a faded army jacket, and a rusty, unfamiliar revolver. More startling were the scattered papers and maps, covered in cryptic notes and routes that wound like veins across the page. She recognized Samuel's careful handwriting, mingled with another, harsher script. The papers told a fragmented story, strange transactions, names of men Clara didn't know, routes that skirted the town and vanished into the wild hills. There was mention of a bank, a list of dates, and a single phrase underlined 3 times, "Don't trust Mallory." Among the scraps, she found a photograph of Samuel in his younger days, standing beside another man, both faces half in shadow, revolvers strapped to their hips. Clara's mind raced. She wondered how much of Samuel's life had been hidden from her, what danger she might have unknowingly inherited. Clutching the revolver, she climbed out of the cellar, heart thumping so hard she thought it might burst. She locked the barn tight behind her and hurried back to the house, her world suddenly smaller and far more dangerous than before. That night, the air buzzed with tension. Clara sat by the kitchen table, spreading the documents before her, trying to piece together their meaning. The only thing clear was that Samuel had been involved in something dark, something that might explain the threats, the rancher's sudden hostility, and his mysterious death. Every line she read made her more certain. His death had not been an accident. She was still poring over the papers when the wind shifted outside, bringing with it the scent of smoke. Clara's blood ran cold. She raced to the window just in time to see orange flames licking at the edge of her north pasture. 2 figures, barely more than shadows, sprinted away from the burning grass, disappearing into the darkness. Panic surged through her. She grabbed a bucket and ran for the well, fighting the blaze with frantic desperation. Her hands blistered, her lungs burned, but she managed to beat down the fire before it could spread to the barn or the house. Exhausted, filthy, and shaking, Clara collapsed on the porch, staring out at the charred earth. In the silence, she heard voices carrying on the night wind, 2 men arguing near the fence line. She crept closer, pressing herself into the shadows. Their words were sharp, urgent, heavy with intent. "She's stubborn. If she doesn't sell, we torch the whole place," one hissed. "Tomorrow night, then," replied the other. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. The ranchers weren't just trying to frighten her. They meant to destroy everything she had left. As the moon climbed higher, Clara's fear mingled with fury. The threats, the sabotage, the fire, they were all part of a campaign to drive her out. But now, with the secret hidden beneath her barn, she sensed there was more at stake than just land. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the past, and now it was clawing its way back into the light. She barely slept, haunted by questions. At dawn, the stranger appeared again, silent and imposing at the edge of the barn, face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Clara froze, hand tightening on the revolver. Without a word, he stepped forward from the shadows. His voice was a low warning, barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what you're holding on to." Before she could respond, he melted back into the night, leaving Clara with a growing certainty that she stood at the heart of a storm she barely understood. Samuel's secrets were no longer buried. They were alive, and the whole town was coming for her. The days that followed became a blur of smoke and tension, the walls of the Whitfield ranch closing in as if the land itself had turned against Clara. She hardly recognized her own reflection in the mirror. Sleepless, dirt-smudged, her eyes haunted by secrets and the threat of violence. Each sunrise brought new trouble, each night more restless than the last. The wounds of Samuel's loss remained raw, but now Clara found herself fighting for more than grief. She was fighting for her life and the last piece of her world. The attack came without warning. Clara was hauling water from the well at dawn, the mist still clinging to the low hills, when the smell of smoke stabbed through the air again. She spun around and saw flames licking at the edges of the western paddock, where the barn and stable stood, sheltering the few horses she had left. Panic surged through her. Dropping the bucket, she sprinted across the yard, heart pounding, dress tangling around her boots. The fire had caught quick, flames roaring in the dry wind, and the horses screamed in panic, kicking at their stalls. Clara wasted no time. She threw open the stable doors, her lungs filling with acrid smoke, her hands shaking as she fumbled with halters and gates. The horses bolted into the yard, manes wild, hooves tearing up the hard earth. Clara staggered out behind them, hacking and gasping, eyes streaming. The fire consumed the stable in minutes, the heat blistering her skin. But somehow, she managed to save the animals. By the time the blaze died, half the paddock was a blackened scar. Clara collapsed on the porch, soot streaking her cheeks, the taste of ashes on her tongue. She stared at the smoldering ruin, chest heaving, and understood that this was no longer intimidation. This was war. The attacks escalated. One by one, her best horses fell ill. At first, Clara thought it was stress or bad water, but then she found the traces of poison near the trough. A prized mare vanished from the pasture, her lead rope cut clean through. A week later, Clara stumbled upon another note, pinned to her front door with a knife. Its message was chilling in its simplicity. Last warning. Leave or die. That night, as the wind screamed through broken windows and the moon slipped behind clouds, Clara heard movement in the yard. Shadows flickered along the fence line. 3 figures, moving with practiced caution. She held her breath, crouched in darkness, Samuel's revolver in her hand. The barn creaked. A sudden crash, the scent of kerosene, and a whoosh of flames. Someone had set fire to the remaining hay store. Clara ran outside, firing blindly into the night. The figures vanished. Her shouts echoed back at her, swallowed by the howling wind and the roar of the fire. As dawn broke, The ranch was a ruin of blackened wood and churned mud. The townsfolk who came to help brought little more than judgment and whispers. Some shook their heads, calling her cursed. Others offered insincere condolences while eyeing the land with barely concealed greed. Mallory arrived on horseback, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his sharp eyes. He dismounted slowly, surveying the wreckage with a practiced indifference. He didn't bother with small talk. "You've got 3 days to pack up and go," he told Clara, his voice cold as stone. "If you stay, you'll lose everything. Maybe your life, too." The threat hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Mallory spat in the dirt and rode off, his men trailing behind like vultures waiting for a carcass to fall. Clara watched them leave, rage simmering beneath her fear. The law was no help. The sheriff barely hid his allegiance, shrugging when she demanded an investigation, muttering about bad luck and accidents. Even the local hands who once worked her land kept their distance now, not wanting to risk Mallory's wrath. Clara understood. She was alone. The town had chosen sides, and she was on the losing end. But in the darkness that night, as Clara sat in the ruined kitchen, her resolve hardened. She remembered Samuel's voice in the old barn, promising her a life of peace, a fresh start. That life had been stolen, but Clara still possessed the will to fight. The evidence she'd found, the maps, the hidden room, the warning against Mallory, burned in her memory, a puzzle she was determined to solve. She was cleaning her cuts by lamplight when the stranger appeared at the window. He watched her for a moment, face shadowed and unreadable, then slipped a battered envelope beneath the door before disappearing again. Clara snatched it up, fingers trembling. Inside, a single photograph. Samuel and Mallory, young and wild-eyed, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, revolvers at their sides. Scrawled on the back was a single line in Samuel's hand. "Trust no one." Not even the law. The meaning was clear. The truth was buried deep, but Clara was done being afraid. If Mallory wanted a fight, she would give him one. She loaded the revolver, lit a lamp, and prepared herself for the long, dangerous nights ahead. Out on the prairie, the wolves howled. In the distance, the wind rattled the broken fence posts, carrying with it the promise of a reckoning that would change everything. For days, Clara moved through the charred remains of her ranch with a sense of grim purpose, her grief transforming into a raw, burning determination. The air still carried the acrid stench of burned hay and scorched wood, but where fear had once ruled her heart, now a cold anger took its place. She knew what was at stake. This was more than a struggle over land. It was a test of her very spirit, and Clara Whitfield refused to lose. Her hands, once soft from years of careful homemaking, became rough and calloused as she threw herself into hard labor. Every day before dawn, she rode the fence line, repairing what had been cut or torn down by Mallory's men. She patched the roof, mended broken gates, and nursed the poisoned horses back from the brink. The work was endless, but she attacked it with a vengeance, her resolve growing with every obstacle. One morning, while she practiced loading and firing Samuel's old revolver in the backyard, the report echoing over the empty prairie, she spotted a figure on horseback approaching through the haze of rising dust. Instinctively, her grip tightened on the gun, but as the rider drew closer, Clara recognized the battered old hat and crooked smile of Ben Harmon, a ranch hand who had worked for Samuel in the early days. Ben dismounted with the quiet weariness of a man who'd seen too much trouble and not enough peace. "Heard you could use a pair of hands," he said simply. Clara didn't ask why he'd come back. She only nodded, relief mingling with suspicion. In a place where trust had become a rare and precious thing, Ben's return felt like a small victory. Together, they fell into the old rhythm of work, tending cattle, hauling water, and sharing silent meals in the half-ruined kitchen. In the evenings, after the chores were done, Clara pored over the mysterious maps and documents from the hidden cellar. With Ben's help, she deciphered the cryptic routes and unfamiliar names, finding patterns in the chaos. The clues led her to an old ledger tucked away in Samuel's desk, its pages covered in coded transactions and strange marks. One name appeared again and again: Mallory. The further she dug, the clearer it became that Samuel's death and the assault on her ranch were no accident. Mallory was pulling every string, determined to erase whatever secrets Samuel had left behind. Determined to expose the truth, Clara rode into town to speak with the sheriff. The ride felt longer than ever, the townsfolk's eyes following her as she passed, whispers curling through the dry air like dust devils. She entered the sheriff's office, clutching the envelope of evidence. The sheriff barely looked up, his boots propped on the desk. His voice was casual, but there was a tightness around his eyes. Clara presented her findings, her voice steady even as his gaze grew colder. He dismissed her claims with a shrug, telling her that folks round here don't take kindly to accusations without proof. Clara realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the law was not on her side. If anything, the sheriff was in Mallory's pocket, just another pawn in a game much older and darker than she'd ever imagined. She left the office with a hard knot of rage in her chest, her hope for justice dwindling but not dead. Back at the ranch, Ben brought news that chilled Clara further. He'd heard from a drifter that Mallory had been seen meeting in secret with 2 other ranchers, men rumored to have been involved in criminal dealings years ago. They were plotting something, Ben warned, and time was running out. But Clara would not let fear rule her. She began to train every day, not just with the revolver but on horseback, learning to ride fast and shoot straight. She practiced until her muscles screamed and her hands blistered, her determination hardening into something fierce and unbreakable. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of crimson, Clara and Ben found themselves riding the boundary of the ranch. In the fading light, they discovered a half-buried lockbox hidden beneath a pile of stones. Inside were more documents, ledgers, photographs, and a sealed letter addressed to Clara in Samuel's handwriting. The contents revealed the final connection. Mallory had been involved in a string of robberies with Samuel in his youth. Samuel had tried to leave that life behind, but Mallory had not. The more Clara read, the more she understood why her husband had been so haunted in his final days, and why the attacks had grown so vicious. Armed with the truth, Clara realized she was no longer a victim. The days of cowering were over. She would fight, not just for herself or Samuel's memory, but for justice and for the right to determine her own future, whatever it might cost. As night fell, Clara watched the distant lanterns of Mallory's men flicker on the horizon, her grip tightening on the revolver. The battle for Whitfield Ranch was just beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. By the time the first autumn chill swept down from the mountains, Clara Whitfield's name had become a curse on the prairie wind. She could feel it in the way townsfolk paused and fell silent when she rode by. The sideways glances at the mercantile, the sudden, inexplicable shortages at the feed store and the market. Once, she might have believed that the townspeople were simply wary of misfortune or gossip. But now the suspicion had hardened into something sharper, a kind of collective judgment that pressed in on her from all sides. Rumors moved faster than wildfire through dry grass. There were whispers in the saloon about the mysterious fire that gutted her barn, about poisoned horses and vanished livestock. Some claimed Clara was cursed. Others muttered that she had played a role in Samuel's death, hoping to inherit the ranch and fortune. By the end of the week, even the children watched her with wide, uncertain eyes as she passed, clutching their mother's skirts and shrinking away as if she carried some invisible blight. Practical matters soon followed suit. Shopkeepers who once greeted her with warm smiles now pretended not to see her. The blacksmith claimed he was too busy to repair her wagon wheel. The general store refused to sell her any more feed on credit, and the local buyers found excuses to reject her harvest, no matter how fine her grain or how fat her cattle. A world that had once been her home now seemed to push her to the margins, determined to drive her out as surely as Mallory's men with their threats and fires. Even Ben, loyal as he was, grew uneasy under the town's collective gaze. He worked with his head down, wary of being seen at her side, and began sleeping in the hayloft rather than the bunkhouse, as if distance might shield him from guilt by association. Clara understood. It was safer in this place, not to be close to a woman marked by whispers and bad luck. The strain pressed hard on Clara, but she refused to show weakness. She maintained the routines Samuel had drilled into her: early mornings, careful ledgers, the steady grind of chores. She studied the documents and letters late into the night, trying to piece together the riddle that seemed to have poisoned her life. With every passing day, she became more convinced that the answer to her husband's death and her own peril was hidden in those cryptic notes and names, locked away in the past. But as her determination hardened, so too did the world around her. One evening, after a long day spent repairing fence lines, Clara found another anonymous note tucked under her plate at the dinner table. The paper was rough, the message scrawled in a hurried, angry hand. "Run now, or I'll expose your husband's past to everyone." The words struck her like a slap, confirming what she already feared. Someone out there knew Samuel's secrets and intended to use them against her. The memory of the stranger at the barn, his warning voice, "You have no idea what you're holding on to," echoed in her mind with fresh urgency. Clara knew her choices were narrowing. She could flee, leave the ranch and the ghosts behind, or she could dig deeper, risking everything to discover the full truth. Fear gnawed at her resolve, but so did pride, a stubborn, wild force that Samuel had once loved about her. She chose the latter, determined to follow the tangled trail no matter where it led. The nights grew longer and colder. Alone in the house, she read through Samuel's old journals, tracing his travels and the men he'd once called friends. The story that emerged was stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Bank heists in distant towns, coded meetings on the outskirts of civilization, a hidden past that threatened to drag her down with it. The pieces slowly fell into place, revealing a web of corruption and betrayal that stretched from her own kitchen to the highest offices in town. One evening, while scouring a faded envelope from the lockbox, Clara found a letter addressed not to Samuel, but to the town sheriff, a man who had stood by Mallory, dismissing her pleas for justice. The letter was full of veiled threats and promises, hinting at secrets that could ruin reputations, destroy fortunes, and topple the fragile peace of the valley. Clara's hands shook as she realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. Her husband's life and death were tied to a crime so large It implicated nearly every powerful man in town. As the wind rattled the windows and shadows flickered across the empty rooms, Clara sat in the lamplight, eyes burning with exhaustion and fury. She knew there was no way out now except through. Her only allies were the truth and her own iron will. The cost of discovering her husband's secrets would be high, but not as high as the price of running. Outside, the night pressed against the house, heavy and watchful. But inside, Clara plotted her next move, determined to face down the darkness with the last of her strength. The war for the Whitfield Ranch, and for her own soul, was far from over. The days grew short and restless, shadows pooling earlier each evening as Clara worked like someone possessed. She moved through the lonely house and broken pastures, as if following invisible threads only she could sense, driven by a growing certainty that every answer she needed was close, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The town's hostility had reached a fever pitch, but by now, fear felt distant, outpaced by the strange, cold determination that had overtaken her heart. She lived in the pages of Samuel's journals, the scrawled maps, and the cryptic letters she had unearthed from his secret cellar. Each night, hunched over the kitchen table by lantern light, she searched for meaning in Samuel's careful script and in the more frantic, slanted handwriting of someone else. The story that emerged felt impossible, like something from the old dime novels. Bank robberies, desperate escapes, promises broken, and fortunes lost. But as she matched the routes on the maps to landmarks on her own land, a new pattern formed, one that led her to a forgotten corner of the property. One rain-lashed afternoon, Clara found herself digging in the mud behind an old, collapsed shed where Samuel had always forbidden her to go. Her shovel struck something hard, a rusted tin box sealed with tar and rope. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters and official-looking papers, all marked with the emblem of the local bank. There were diagrams and a single tattered photograph showing Samuel and 3 other men. One of them unmistakably the sheriff, another the unmistakable hawk-eyed Mallory. The third face belonged to a stranger she'd glimpsed only at the edge of every disaster since Samuel's death. Her heart thudded as she read the letters, her hands muddy and trembling. Samuel had been at the center of the largest bank heist the region had ever seen, a secret, meticulously planned job with inside help from men who now ran the town. The haul had never been recovered. The town had whispered for years about the lost money, the treacheries, the violence that had followed. Now Clara saw that the reason her husband had died was tangled up with these secrets, buried and denied by those with the most to lose. The shock of betrayal numbed her. The man she had loved, who had left behind gentle memories and small private kindnesses, was also the architect of a crime that had shattered lives. The ranch, it turned out, had never truly belonged to her or Samuel. It was paid for, in part, by a portion of the missing loot, disguised through a web of crooked bank dealings. If these truths ever came to light, the entire town, especially Mallory, the sheriff, and their closest allies, would be ruined. The past crashed in on her all at once. Clara saw her own suffering in a new, painful light, but she also saw the shape of her enemies' desperation. They weren't just greedy. They were afraid. Afraid of what she might find. Afraid of the power the truth could give her. They would burn the ranch, destroy her reputation, and kill her if they had to, just to keep these secrets buried. That evening, as a bitter wind rattled the shutters and rain pounded the roof, Clara sensed she was not alone. The stranger appeared in her doorway, muddy boots and cold eyes, holding himself like a man who had never known a safe place. He stepped inside without a word and tossed a battered envelope onto the table. Inside was a letter, written in Samuel's hand, one last confession. It named the stranger as his partner in the robbery, left for dead and betrayed when the others had double-crossed him. He had returned for vengeance, but also for answers. His presence had been both a warning and a test. The full weight of the moral dilemma pressed down on Clara. She could keep the truth to herself, use it as leverage to secure her land and safety. She knew now that she held the fate of the powerful men in her hands. Or she could expose everything, risking her life to bring the truth into the light and free herself, finally, from the legacy of secrets and violence. Clara stared at the pile of evidence, at Samuel's familiar handwriting, at the faces in the photograph that stared back at her from across decades of lies. She thought of the cost already paid, the ranch in ruins, her own innocence gone, a town poisoned by greed and cowardice. Night deepened, and the rain washed the last dust from the window panes. Clara rose from the table, her mind made up. There would be no more hiding. Whatever the price, she would dawn broke gray and heavy over the Whitfield ranch, the sky smeared with the colors of old bruises. Clara stood alone at the edge of her land, the autumn wind tugging at her coat. Her mind braced for the storm to come. She was no longer the frightened widow hiding behind locked doors. She was a woman transformed by grief and hard-earned truth, every muscle coiled with a steely resolve. The evidence she'd gathered, the confession, the photographs, the bank documents, were locked in a battered tin box beneath her floorboards. It was all she had left of Samuel, and it was everything needed to bring down the men who'd haunted her. She moved quickly and quietly that morning, riding to the edge of town beneath a sky swollen with rain. With each hoofbeat, Clara rehearsed the words she'd write to the distant city newspaper, the only place she trusted to break the story wide open. She spent hours drafting the letter in her careful, looping script, every sentence a stone in the foundation of her defiance. She described the robbery, the secret meetings, the men who had orchestrated the entire affair, and how their power depended on silence, fear, and violence. She sent the package off by coach, handing it to a mailman she barely knew, praying that the weight of what she'd uncovered would be enough to tip the scales of justice. As she watched the carriage rattle down the road and disappear over the rise, Clara felt both lighter and infinitely more exposed. There was no turning back now. She had thrown a match into the powder keg and knew the explosion would reach her first. As dusk fell, Clara prepared the house as if for siege. She nailed boards across the windows, dragged heavy furniture in front of the doors, and moved quietly through each room, checking every lock and hinge. Her mind spun with memories. Samuel's laughter in the kitchen, the way the barn smelled of hay and sunlight, the soft cadence of the ranch at peace. All of it felt far away now, threatened by the violence that hovered just outside her walls. Ben found her stacking buckets of water in the kitchen. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen the tension rising for weeks. Together, they set traps around the yard, hidden pits, wires strung low in the grass, lanterns doused and ready to be set ablaze. Clara taught herself to move through the darkness with the revolver cradled in her palm, her heart a cold, steady drumbeat. By midnight, the ranch felt like a fortress, lonely, battered, but not yet broken. Clara stood at the upstairs window, watching for any sign of movement. Across the fields, small lanterns bobbed at the edge of the woods. She knew who they belonged to. Mallory and his men, hungry for retribution, desperate to erase every trace of the old crime before it could destroy them. She pressed her forehead to the glass, feeling the shape of fear but refusing to let it claim her. The stranger appeared again in the shadows by the barn, hat pulled low, every movement deliberate and quiet. He didn't step forward, didn't offer comfort. Instead, he watched the horizon, where the lights of the attackers gathered like a coming storm. He tossed a small pouch of extra cartridges through the open window and vanished without a word, a final warning, or perhaps a gesture of faith that Clara was ready to face what waited in the darkness. Inside, Clara made her last preparations. She wrapped Samuel's revolver in oilcloth and tied it to her belt. She stuffed the most damning pieces of evidence into her shirt in case she needed to make a run for it. Ben waited near the back door, axe in hand, his face pale but resolved. They spoke little. What could be said now? That would matter. The moment had become larger than words. As the hour grew late and the sky blackened to pitch, the distant lights of the town flickered out, one by one, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Mallory's men were coming. Clara felt it in her bones. This was her home, her last stand. The memory of Samuel's voice steadied her, the promise he'd made that this land would always be hers if she fought for it. Thunder rumbled on the horizon, mixing with the rumble of horses' hooves. The world narrowed to the tiny pool of light around the ranch house, every sense sharpened. Clara crouched beside the barricaded door, hands steady, her mind crystal clear. She wasn't just fighting for herself or for Samuel's ghost. She was fighting for the right to live honestly, to claim her own story from the ashes of the past. Outside, the attackers gathered. Their shadows stretched long in the lamplight. The time for running had ended. Clara rose to her feet, shoulders squared, ready to face whatever storm the night would bring. Night pressed heavy against the Whitfield ranch, the fields and fences lost to darkness save for the flicker of distant lanterns. For a long, breathless hour, Clara waited behind the barricaded door, every sense straining for the first sign of attack. The world outside was so quiet it seemed unreal, as if all the prairie had drawn itself inward, waiting for the violence about to break. Then, just before midnight, a horse screamed somewhere in the lower pasture and all hell broke loose. A volley of gunshots cracked the silence. Clara flinched, but kept her place, heart pounding with a strange, icy calm. The front gate splintered under the force of a boot, men's voices barking orders through the yard. Mallory's men, faces masked by bandanas and shadows, swarmed forward, axes and torches in hand. Lantern light danced on the barrel of a rifle. They called her name, threatening, cursing, promising ruin if she did not come out. Somewhere near the barn, Ben fired a warning shot, his shout cutting through the noise before being swallowed up by the storm of footsteps and gunfire. Clara pressed herself against the wall, steadying her breath. The house shuddered under the assault. Windows shattered, smoke curling in where torches landed on the porch. She remembered Samuel's stories of outlaws and sieges and realized she was living her own legend now. For a split second she was afraid, but then something inside her broke free. She moved like she'd trained, slipping through shadows, revolver in hand, using every trick she'd learned. She fired through broken glass at the first shadow that crossed her yard, watching it tumble and vanish. Then another. The air was thick with gunpowder and the sickly sweet tang of burning wood. Outside, the stranger appeared in the chaos, darting from shadow to shadow with the deadly grace of a man born for violence. He picked off Mallory's men with quiet efficiency, forcing them to duck and scatter. One by one, the invaders lost their nerve, retreating behind wagons or crawling through the mud, but Mallory himself was relentless, bellowing orders, forcing the fight forward. Clara's mind moved quickly, recalling every trap she'd set with Ben. Tripwires, pits, buckets of sand rigged to fall. As the gang pressed closer, she set her own house ablaze at the base of the walls, driving the attackers back with a wall of smoke and flame. She moved from room to room, using the smoke as cover, shooting when she saw movement, retreating before anyone could flank her. Bullets ripped through the walls. A lantern burst at her feet, and fire bloomed along the floorboards. Clara leapt through the flames, rolling across the porch as shots tore up the night around her. In the yard, Ben swung his axe wildly, cutting down one attacker before two more dragged him to the ground. Clara fired into the melee, driving them off just long enough for Ben to crawl behind the overturned water trough, blood darkening his sleeve. "Keep going!" he yelled, voice hoarse with pain. But Clara was already moving, every step a battle for survival. Near the barn, the stranger faced off with Mallory, the two men circling each other in the dance of old enemies. Mallory fired first, missing wide. The stranger closed in, grappling with him until both crashed to the ground. Clara saw it all through smoke and flickering firelight, a tangle of limbs, fists, and violence. There was a sharp crack as a gun went off, and Mallory screamed. The stranger staggered away, clutching his side, but Mallory was on his knees now, cursing and bleeding. Clara sprinted to the stranger's side just as another gunshot rang out. A bullet tore through her shoulder, spinning her into the dirt. She bit down on the pain, gritting her teeth as she crawled for cover. Blood soaked her shirt, but she kept her grip on the revolver, eyes fixed on Mallory as he struggled to rise. The stranger, pale and swaying, pressed something into Clara's hand. A folded scrap of paper, the map to the hidden loot that had haunted so many lives. "Take it," he whispered, voice thick with blood and regret. "It's the only thing that will keep you safe now." Then he turned, firing one last shot at Mallory's men, forcing them into the open as the sheriff's posse, finally roused by the noise, thundered down the road from town. In the confusion, the sheriff himself was caught in the crossfire, his allegiances exposed for all to see. With Clara's evidence and the wounded stranger's dying confession, the truth poured out as dawn broke over the ruined ranch. Mallory was left bleeding and defeated, the stolen money and the web of lies finally dragged into the light. The law, awakened by the noise and drawn by the promise of justice, moved in to finish what Clara had started. As the sun climbed over the burning wreckage, Clara slumped to the ground, spent and bleeding, but alive. Around her, the ranch smoldered, her home battered, her friends wounded, her enemies vanquished. The fight was over, but the cost had been steep. The final secrets had been laid bare, and in the smoke and ruin, a new day was breaking. Morning rose slow and golden over the battered remains of the Whitfield Ranch. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving behind blackened beams and charred earth. But the air was strangely clear, almost peaceful after the storm. The world seemed to hold its breath, watching as the wreckage settled and the last echoes of violence faded into memory. Clara lay on a cot in the parlor, her shoulder tightly bandaged, breath shallow but strong. The pain radiated down her arm, throbbing in time with her heartbeat, but she refused the laudanum offered by the doctor. She needed her mind clear. All around her, the house bustled with unexpected kindness. Neighbors bringing soup, the town's women cleaning and tending to the wounded, men hauling buckets of water to douse the last stubborn embers. For days, these same people had turned away from her, their eyes cold with suspicion and fear. Now, they greeted her with quiet awe and hesitant smiles, whispering her name with something close to respect. The sheriff was gone, arrested on the very steps of his office, his secrets dragged into the light. Mallory and his remaining men, bloodied and broken, were hauled away by deputies from a neighboring county. Their faces were grim with defeat, their threats finally silenced. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt the tension release from her body, as if the land itself was letting out a long-held breath. Ben survived his wounds and became a steady, comforting presence at her side. The stranger who had haunted the ranch for so long was gone, leaving behind only the map and a blood-stained letter. His name, she learned, would never be spoken again in polite company. But his role in the story, like Samuel's, was etched forever in the fields and timbers of Whitfield land. Days passed. The town buzzed with rumors and revelations. Reporters arrived on the next coach, eager for interviews and photographs, hungry for details of the scandal that had rocked the county. Clara gave them only what she wanted remembered: the facts about the robbery, the corruption of the men who thought themselves untouchable, and the ordinary courage it took to stand against them. She left out the most painful truths: the betrayals, the moments of fear, the losses that still ached every time she closed her eyes. One afternoon, after the reporters had gone and the house stood empty again, Clara took the map and the old revolver and walked out into the fields. The prairie stretched out in every direction, the grass gold and waving, washed clean by rain. She followed the directions Samuel had left, crossing the creek, past the twisted oak tree, and finally reaching a patch of ground marked with a simple stone. She knelt, fingers digging into the soft earth until she felt the edges of an old iron box. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was the missing fortune, the loot that had cursed the ranch and ruined so many lives. Clara sat back on her heels, staring at the fortune in silence. The money could rebuild her home, buy more land, erase every debt she owed. But she also saw what it represented: a legacy of pain and violence, a temptation to start the same old cycle all over again. She remembered the lessons Samuel had tried to teach her, the love they'd built with sweat and hope and honesty. In the end, Clara made her choice. She reburied the box beneath the oak tree, leaving it for some future generation to find or for the earth to claim. She would start fresh with what she had left: the ranch, her name, her scars. That was enough. The weeks that followed brought slow, steady change. The fields began to recover, green shoots poking through the blackened soil. The townsfolk returned to her side, offering help without shame or hesitation. Clara found herself welcomed again at the market, her cattle and grain now sought after rather than shunned. In their eyes, she saw gratitude, humility, and a new respect born from what she had endured. Through it all, Clara remained changed, stronger, quieter, her gaze sharper and more patient. The land was hers again, not because she had fought for vengeance, but because she had chosen truth over silence, dignity over revenge. Her story spread beyond the county, becoming legend, the widow who had stood alone and turned the tide. As summer rolled in, Clara stood one evening at the edge of her porch, watching the sun bleed gold across the hills. Her shadow stretched long over the prairie, reaching toward a future she could finally shape for herself. The wounds would heal, the nightmares would fade, and in time, the ranch would once again become a place of laughter and new beginnings. She looked down at her hands, scarred, rough, but steady. The same hands that had buried Samuel fought for her life and planted the seeds of her second chance. Sometimes, Clara thought, the only thing that keeps a person standing is the truth, no matter how dangerous it is. And as the wind carried her hair and skirt, she smiled into the dusk, ready to begin again.